I'm so pleased to be able to say hello to you again. And when I say hello, I'm always saying in my heart, God bless you, because we all need a bit of a blessing from God, and I wish such for you this day. I do indeed. I mention from time to time, as some of you faithful souls know, what I happen to be reading these days in the Bible. For the last 10 days, I suppose, or perhaps a little bit more, I have been reading in the epistles of 1st and 2nd Peter, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, and Jude. And what has struck me in reading those epistles is that there was trouble, the possibility of error and of heresy in the Christian church right from the outset. I'm quite astonished by this when I stop to think about it. One would assume, I think, that since God was investing the eternal project in the human instrumentality of a church with capital C, that they would have in their hands such a structure of doctrine and of truth that there'd be no chance for anything to go astray. And that if there were any heresy that would arise in the church, you'd think it would take 100 or 200 years at least for the heresies to appear. The fact of the matter is, when you're reading 1st and 2nd Peter and 1st and 2nd and 3rd John and Jude, you discover what you already have learned in Galatians and in some other epistles, that heresy raised its ugly head in the church. False teaching asserted itself right from the outset in the church. Isn't that fascinating? And isn't it, on the one hand, rather encouraging? Encouraging from the point of view that when we come across disturbances in the church today, disagreements, these manifestations of how human the members of the church are, we shouldn't say to ourselves, how can this be? We might be very philosophical about it and say, it's always been that way. That's what it comes from having human beings in the church. Because we human beings filter things through our own intelligence, or what we fondly call our intelligence, and wonder, therefore, how it could be that we disagree with one another. Of course we would. And we must then find the truth. The New Testament teaches us that they had to struggle to hold to the truth even in the first century of the church. Those epistles were written in what might be called the end of the first generation of Christians and the beginning of the second generation of Christians. And in that early time, when some of the apostles were still living, and when so many of the people who were living and belonging to the churches were people who had very possibly seen our Lord in person, or knew someone who had, still, already, false doctrine, false teaching was asserting its ugly head. And the apostles were forced to deal with errors of teaching. Thank God they did. And thank God we have a record of it. Thank God that the Scriptures are so honest, so forthright. The Scriptures don't give us the idea that the first Christians were perfect and they all just lived in marvelous harmony. The Scriptures acknowledge that from the outset you had to hold to the faith because there was always something to intrude upon the faith and take it from the believers, if at all possible. In the midst of that, doctrine is laid out there in the epistles. And I have the feeling often when somebody comes up with some new idea that they say they just learned about, I want to say when I hear some of these new ideas, it's really not that new. It was a false doctrine in the first century. It's a false doctrine still. And the New Testament dealt with that, and we must deal with it now and live as best we can to keep purity of faith. We'll find that purity of faith in the teaching of the Scriptures, and then in the structure of the first centuries of the church, when in church councils they established in still more structured form what the church would have as the truth in the great creeds, in the great discussions of the church councils. So don't be too discouraged that not too good ideas sometimes arise, and that sometimes the faith seems in peril, because it always has been in peril. There has always been false teaching, raising up, asking for an audience, and it has always been the business of the people of God to go back to the Scriptures, go back to the teachings of the book, and to hold steady before God. That's what's on my mind today, and I'm happy to have a chance to leave with you. God bless.